a sleepless bed, but you're wasting your time trying to lose the blues.
Well, I'm delighted to have with me in the studio today the two people who really need no introduction. We've got Sir David Carter, formerly the Regional Schools Commissioner, now working with Ambition Institution, and Laura McInerney, the founder of TeacherTapp, or co-founder of TeacherTapp, I should say, to be entirely accurate, and former editor of Schools Week. Thank you very much both for joining us. And we're going to talk a little bit about a book that you've written together. Laura, you've got a copy of the book right there. Can you hold it up? I've only got a PDF on the phone. There it is.
All right. It's all very arty here. Yeah, Leading Academy Trusts.
So tell me, Laura, how you came to write the book with David, because it's very much David's voice and vision in the book.
It absolutely is. And the reason I got involved was knowing David from when I was at Schools Week. We obviously covered his time as the National Schools Commissioner a lot. Sometimes very positively. David will say himself, sometimes not always quite so positive. And it's really important about David's journey through the school sector is he's been the forefront of the academy trusts, the increase in academy trusts. And he was the only person who has been a head teacher, then over a federation, then over a multi-academy trust, then became a regional schools commissioner, and finally the national schools commissioner. So what he's seen in terms of how academy trusts can deliver for young people and how it goes wrong was just, there isn't anybody else out there. And the one thing we agreed on was the title is Leading Academy Trusts, but it does have this, why some fail but most don't. And I only said I would agree to write it if we were going to be honest and talk about the fact that this wasn't just a perfect solution for everything. We had to say when these things didn't work and when they did. So it's been an amazing honour, actually, to be able to sit and listen to David talk so much over the last couple of years and get it into the book. Just an amazing opportunity.
Thanks. So David, tell us a little bit about, from your end, how the process worked.
Well, everything Laura said is absolutely right. It was really important for me to work with somebody that I trusted, and Laura was somebody I have a huge fondness and respect for from the time that we started to work together at Schools Week, and there were a number of moments where fondness may not have been the immediate reaction when Schools Week came out on a Friday, but it was the reporting was always done with great integrity and with real wisdom, I felt. And I knew I was going to find it very difficult to sit down and write a book from scratch, partly because there was so much I wanted to say, and I wasn't sure I'd be able to order it. And so the way that we worked was perfect for me in that we talked about the structure of the book. I would then write some PowerPoint slides about the themes. Laura would then interview me about the slides, and we talk about them, and then she'd write a draft. And from the basis of that draft, I would then start to try to write it in a style that sounded like me, I suppose, and was authentically coming out of my mouth as opposed to any other way of doing it. And I thought, as a model, it was great to work that way because it meant that we could completely refine it. And there were a couple of occasions where things changed, policy changed, or something else happened, and we were able to adapt to that. So it was a kind of a journey about the academy movement that I was so heavily involved in. But it was also about a journey from how the hell did a music teacher from South Wales get to be the National Schools Commissioner, and I wanted to tell that story because we need more people to think they can do that.
Great, yeah, and so that the way the book reads remarkably well, and you were telling me earlier about the opening letter, which I think is a great way to start the book. And for those of you, the few viewers that haven't yet read David and Laura's book, it begins with a letter that David writes to himself at the brink of taking up his first headship. David, tell us a little bit about that letter.
So I have to give Laura the credit for this. She talked to me a lot about writing a letter to my former self, imagining that I was on my first day of headship in 1997, and that 30 years later, the 60-year-old David was writing a letter to his younger self. And I took a bit of convincing that was the right thing to do. And originally we talked about putting it as an appendix at the end, because I didn't really want the book to be a leadership book in the sense that other leadership books are about. And Laura then convinced me, absolutely rightly, that we should put it up front and we should open the book with this. And quite often the people who've seen it, colleagues in the system have really liked that. But also my kids and Claire, my wife, she also thought it was a great way to start the book. And so I feel really confident that it's an opportunity to talk a bit about myself and about my journey before we talk about the detail of the text and what the book is fundamentally about. And so for me, leadership is about inspiring people and taking people on a journey with you. And I think the letter articulated some of that and talked about how important it was to be grounded and be authentic and not think you know all the answers. Some of the things which I saw people not always exhibit that led to their downfall.
It certainly comes across as very human. Laura, what gave you the idea then of persuading David to begin in this way?
I think when we got to the end of the book, and we'd been working on it at that point for about a year, and it is quite a dense book. There's a lot in this and a lot about management, accountability, responsibility. Those are hard things. We've made it as accessible as we can, but there's no getting away from it that some of this stuff is challenging. And so at the end, it felt as if you didn't just want to leave people having discussed governance and accountability. What are the lessons that should sum up the book? So I said to David, an easy way to do that, at least to figure out what the lessons are, might be to sit down and write a letter to yourself. And I think all of us can benefit from that actually as a activity at any moment in time, particularly at the end of a job, perhaps before you move into the next one. What do you wish you'd known? And maybe pass that to the people who are going into your position. So having spent a year writing this, David then goes away for about a day, writes this letter, sends it back, and I read it and I'm in tears. And I'm just like, this is amazing. This person who said, oh, I can't sit down and write, did it completely without me. And I thought, well, not only is this brilliant, but actually it begins the book so well because, yes, it is about leading academy trusts. But people lead academy trusts. A person will be leading it. And we can often lose that human element. And it just brought it in and reminded people that you're going to learn lessons throughout the book that will be important for you. If you don't grasp all of it straight away, that doesn't matter because all of us are learning as we go. And it just opened it up really nicely. It's therefore been brilliant to see so many people pick it up in their reviews on Amazon and in various things on Twitter where people have said this is really good for them. Because, it's such a beautiful piece of writing for which I can take absolutely no credit.
Okay. Oh, well, there's some great stuff in there. So, David, the idea of making, well, not so much an idea, but the advice to yourself about making each conversation a good one. And I really liked that about that how you speak to people is really important in building trust and integrity and all of that sort of thing. And reading between the lines, I had this sense of maybe as a head teacher, maybe as a CEO, maybe there are times when you perhaps didn't get that right, and you're reflecting on that from your now, the vantage of your experience now, and like other advice, like run towards conflict. And I'm wondering, are there occasions that we perhaps didn't hear about when you're reflecting on not having done that to the standard that you would have wished?
Well, it's a high bar to do everything that I say in the book, and I'll be the first to say that before people who work for me tell you that I didn't always get it right. But something that I felt was really important to me personally was about respect and trust for people. When you're in a leadership position, whether it's a head or a CEO or even in the jobs that I had in the DFE, there's always going to be an element of those roles where you have to tell people that either what they're doing isn't what you expect them to do, or it's not good enough, or you've got to be able to have a conversation with them about how they do something better. And that conversation always goes so much more effectively when people believe that feedback is coming from a good place. And I used to wrestle with that. I found that very difficult, particularly in my early years of headship, where it's a hell of a lot easier to tell people how well they're doing. But if you look in the mirror and you know that you've actually over-egged that a little bit, you've just been deceitful, both to yourself and to the person that you've given that feedback to. So I certainly think that was a work in progress for me. I've never been the kind of person that is able to just give somebody bad feedback and shatter them and just leave them to pick up the pieces. I think you've got to take them on that journey, and you've got to be part of the help. But you also have to recognize there are times you have to give people a bit of space to reflect on what you've said. And so I think the elements of holding people to account are such an important part of any leader's role, but to do it with integrity, to do it with compassion and warmth, that's really important. I think people often, there's that wonderful Maya Angelou phrase, isn't there, about people sometimes forget exactly what you said, but think more about how you said it to them.
Right.
And I used to have that quote on the wall in my office in Cabot. And, you know, before I was about to have a difficult conversation, I tried to think what it would be like if I was about to hear what I was about to say to that person being said to me, and to try to help them with that process. And it's working. It's never complete. It's never something you're completely comfortable with, or should be completely comfortable with, to be honest, because you should always be thinking about how you do that better.
Yeah, and this comes across in, you know, another line from that letter where you say to yourself, you know a fraction of what you need to know, and the good or bad news is that this never changes. And I think that that's certainly something for me that comes across in the tone and the spirit of the book, that you're sharing the benefit of your unique and vast experience, but you're not saying I know everything, and you're not saying this is how it needs to be done. It's more, much of the book is structured more along the lines of these things seem more likely to be effective, and these are the things which seem more likely to be the case where we have the sad story of occasionally trusts failing. So go on. Yes,
no, I was just going to say I think that's spot on, because I spend most of my working life these days training school leaders, which is a joy. But I make that point all the time. The moment you think you've cracked it is the moment that bite on the bum is about to arrive on your doorstep.
Yeah, right. Okay. And we can only imagine that that's happened to you, perhaps during your journey. But so a couple of general questions to ask about the book. So that you, in different chapters, you talk about, you know, the indicators for success and the warning lights for failure. Can you tell us a little bit about those and how together you came up with the way that you presented them in the book?
I think they're David's list of things. What I will say is, on the point earlier, David, about how there's not always lots of examples of the failures themselves, either David's own or others. One of the difficult things about when you're writing a book like this is you do want to put those examples in, but we also have to be respectful that, for example, there are always difficult conversations with others. Yeah. And it's the same with the failures. I think one of the critiques that has been made on occasion is it didn't get into enough detail around the failures. But that's very, very difficult, because at the moment there's only been a handful of them. So it would be very easy for people to start believing that they think one of the things we've talked about is a certain trust or a certain person. And so we've tried to keep it really general. And David, I don't know if it might be easy for you to talk about how you came up with that list.
So I think that's a really important point. What I'm looking at are the indicators of what often leads to failure. And I think there are 3 or 4 things that stand out, and then it's a question of scale. Then it doesn't. Some of the things I'm about to say don't necessarily mean that trusts fall over and bad things happen, but they're not positives either. And they, for me, are around these things. First of all, a trust that doesn't articulate the values and the beliefs of why it's in place and what it's set up to do, I think is going to be exposed, because you have to have some concept of what you believe in order for language around moral purpose to mean anything to people. You can't just talk about, improving the life chances of disadvantaged children as a holy grail if you're not very good at it, or you don't make the decisions that help those young people out. I think there's another very clear link to weak governance around this, which is something we talk about a lot. There's a whole chapter on governance in the book. And governance has got to be capable of providing challenge and support, and having that oversight, and where that's missing, often that leads to failure. And I think the other one, which was for me a source of frustration in my DFE days, and to an extent still is this restless debate between autonomy and alignment, and where that leaves us. Because if a multi-academy trust is not about school improvement and delivering a better education for children, then what is the point of it? And so that debate about where the decisions are taken, whether it's taken at school level or whether it's taken at trust level or somewhere in between, for me is the crux of the debate. And I think what we're seeing more and more at the moment with trusts is that they're making that shift towards a better balance between devolving all the responsibility to the schools and beginning to think about what is the practice that the evidence suggests is proven to work, that should become something which all children in the trust have access to. Because for me, the equity and fairness of that is that no matter where a child is educated in the multi-academy trust, the experience they get day in, day out from the classroom teacher that they spend most time with is predicated on evidence that says this is the right way to do something. It's not an experiment, because kids haven't got time to be experimented upon. We need to know that the research drives the answer.
No, and I think I really liked the way that I think you express it as a sort of continuum between tightly organised schools and loosely organised schools within a trust, and that I think you suggest that it's more likely to be effective if you start with really tight controls and allow through success for schools to earn autonomy, and within schools for teachers to earn autonomy, rather than starting with a loose control and then having to tighten up if things go wrong. Does that summarise your position?
It does, but let's also be realistic and not assume the trusts have necessarily got that wrong. The journey post 2010, and Laura was brilliant on this bit, because she understands the history of education secretaries' decision making over the years. But Michael Gove in 2010 was absolutely about the autonomy of school leaders to plough their own destiny, and I would be a complete contradiction if I said I hadn't benefited from that. That I had the space and the freedom to make decisions initially at John Cabot as a school, and then the Cabot Learning Federation, that I benefited from it. But with a high level of autonomy, there has to be a high level of accountability as well, so that somebody's checking that the decisions that people are taking in the interests of young people are the right ones. The only objective that a multi-academy trust is to raise educational standards for the wider public benefit. And so that journey back in 2010 was all about schools know best. And the marketing pitch that many trusts use around that time to schools was, come and join us, and you'll have complete independence, way more than the local authority ever gave you. And of course, what's happened over the last 10 years as the accountability system has changed is that now trusts have realized, well, hang on a second, that was then. The journey is different now, and you're seeing that journey from loose to tight, or being something that many of them are working on. And then the point about, how do you attract good schools to join your trust? If you're saying to a good school to join a multi-academy trust that you have to give up everything that made you a great school and do it our way, they're not going to join. So you have to have the right approach and the right narrative and the right message for the schools at different stages of their improvement cycle.
The bit that made a big difference for me as we were writing it as well was, from the Schools Week perspective, in the years that I'd spent kind of reporting on academy trusts, I was very skeptical often of the idea that autonomy was great because of the lack of accountability, right? So it meant that some people could go off, they were spending money inappropriately, they were making decisions inappropriately, and there wasn't strong enough oversight in some cases, and that failed the young people. So I really thought this book was going to be all about that side of things, tight and loose and earning the autonomy because we don't want bad things to happen. But what David pushes really strongly in this book, and I came to understand through all of our conversations, is it's not just about that. It's the fact that if you just look at it in that way, you miss the fact that there's a really massive benefit that can come from having these tighter structures. There's a really massive benefit that can come from, yes, having autonomy, but with that autonomy, where's your responsibility to use it to improve the other schools? It's not just no one's looking over your shoulder so you can have a whale of a time. It's because you don't have all of these other constraints on you. How are you going to use that time to maybe improve a school that's struggling, or ensure that your staff are trained up even better, or that you're taking on more new staff and training them up and putting them into the system? And in all my years of just shouting about, there's not strong enough oversight, I didn't think that through. And I'm not sure as a newspaper necessarily have pushed that. It's a very difficult and nuanced argument, but really glad that people who are in the system can read this book and think to themselves, yes, my autonomy comes with not just accountability, but responsibility as well.
I think that's a really good way of putting it, and it definitely adds to the argument. And I've just had the recent experience. I'm working a couple of days a week with some schools that are run by Greenshaw Trust, and I've certainly seen the benefits of them having quite tight control over things like, what lessons look like and what content of lessons looks like and what happens in between lessons. And whilst at an individual level, you can feel shackled by some of those choices, seeing the benefit at that whole school level and therefore, across multiple schools at a trust level, that there's clear and definite benefits to that sort of tightness. But I imagine that the schools that I've got that personal experience of are schools which were in special measures and were brokered into a trust and were arguably fairly broken institutions. And the point that you're making earlier there, David, about also wanting to attract good schools into trusts. It's not just schools that have failed that CEOs need to turn around. It's also, how do you sell the benefits of trust membership? And I think there's a lovely bit in the book where you pose the question, so why would anyone ever want to work at this trust? Why would anyone want to work for you? And what's the answer to that, David? Why would a good school want to be part of a trust?
Because a good school in effect becomes your capacity. And I think what we often see is in a so-called school-led system, not every great school can lead the system. And the multi-academy trust as a microsystem, I think, is a really great opportunity. So I think if I was back in my CEO role and I was trying to think about schools that I wanted to join the trust who were good and outstanding, and at a different end of the improvement trajectory, I would be looking to those schools to lead on my curriculum thinking, to lead on my middle leadership development, to think about the way in which we're pushing the boundaries of pedagogical practice, to think about different ways of assessing, maybe even to write my test papers and mark them on behalf of the trust, not make them conform to what everybody else does because their improvement journey has been proven, but to sort of build a capacity around what they're great at, until, of course, such time as they're no longer as great as they thought they were. And then I think the model has to tighten again. But a really important bit of thinking in the school improvement chapter is that notion about schools. Schools are always requiring improvement. Ofsted used that as one of their descriptors. I don't mean that one. I mean literally 20-odd thousand schools in this country require improvement. And it's really just a matter of what and scale. And the most outstanding schools in the country, if you were to really explore them in detail, we'd find elements of weakness. And that's what I'm thinking is around the concept of you need a different kind of message and a different incentive for strong schools to join trusts.
Yeah, okay. And I do think that's an important point that, and you make it in the book, that even the strongest schools have pockets where there are practices which could be improved on, and by the corollary, of course, would be even schools which are in some kind of category will potentially have areas where there's excellence that can be spread. So one of the schools that I'm working with at the moment has one of the best English departments that I've ever worked for, and the head of English in particular is extraordinary. And I think that there's real scope within that trust system for that expertise to find a voice and to find a purpose beyond just chipping away at what needs to happen within an individual school. And that was certainly something I felt much more convinced of reading the book, that the capacity within trusts to have an effect beyond your individual school is unsurpassed, and that's that's certainly something I think you did a very good job of persuading your readers of.
Can I just take that point for a second, because I'll be brief, but I think it's a really good one. So you just talked about in a trust this really good English faculty. Somewhere in the trust will be an English faculty that's not performing as well as that. That's just a reality.
Yes.
But if you believe in the model that the weaker English faculty should be given all of the autonomy to continue doing what they've always done, the gap will just get wider.
Yeah.
And I think what trust leaders are wrestling with is, how do you transmit some of the things that are working in the strong faculty so that the children who go to the other school, who actually probably didn't have any say in that because they live close to the school, they certainly didn't have a say in who taught them in English, because that was the person who did the timetables job. Those children are entitled to that equality of great experience as the children that you described. And that, for me, is the moral purpose, if you like, and the moral argument for why thinking about more alignment across trust is such an important element of the work.
Okay, so that's something I hadn't considered, and it's not something I necessarily picked up from the book. Would it be true to say that within this moral purpose that there's perhaps, that schools that are standing alone, the schools that are not part of trusts, who are very successful, do they have an obligation, perhaps, at some level, to be part of a trust?
Yes, I think they do. I think
Right.
they absolutely do. I think standalone academies are a really interesting part of our sector in the sense that they're allowed to be standalone because they've done really well. The challenge I think that they face is that all of the answers to how they've got to becoming great and how they are going to continue to be great exist within the boundaries of their school and the capacity that they've got in their body of staff, in their workforce. And I think unless you have a mechanism by which you continually challenge your own thinking and you continually work with others to reflect upon whether you're really as strong as you think you are, I think that's one of the reasons why standalone academies over time begin to see their performance dip. Of course, the issue is that there are other ways that you can enable standalone academies to be part of collaborations way beyond just becoming part of a multi-academy trust. But we haven't really got that right, I don't think. I don't think the teaching school model has necessarily done that. I'm not sure that the improvement hub model will have any greater success in that respect. And so I think the challenge for the next iteration of the MAC model and for any education secretary is in sort of MAC 2.0 language, what do we do to hardwire meaningful collaboration across the entire sector and in between trusts where schools are in different organizations? Because unless we get that right, I fear that we're going to end up with some schools still being isolated, but it'll be because their trust is isolated, not the individual school.
That's really interesting, and I'm sure, Laura, you have a view on this.
Yeah, I mean, I think when we talk about the spaghetti diagram earlier, that's the diagram in the book, which is different trajectories that schools can be on. Some go from being, really poorly performing to suddenly great. There are ones that were great that are suddenly poorly performing. One of the most interesting categories in there is this group who just very gradually decline over time. And if you've ever worked or been in one of those schools, you can often feel it. It's like everything's okay, but it's going to be the same in 2 or 3 years' time. And in that time, the types of people who come to the school might change because of demographics in the area. The staff might change, and over time, things are just going to get not quite so good. And if that school is in a standalone academy, particularly in a local authority where there's no support from the council anymore, and where their ability to transform themselves is also gradually declining, they're the group for me who I think are quite a problem. And about 5 years ago, the government did try and get a grip on this with the coasting schools metric. Now, it wasn't a brilliant metric. Everything sort of fell to the wayside anyway. We had a white paper and then Brexit happened and everything disappeared. But frankly, we've all known for a long time that group is there. And what do you do about them and how do you continually make things better for that group is going to become really important, especially as some of those schools will be in areas that in the past have been economically fine, but in the next couple of years may really struggle after the pandemic. There are towns like Crawley, for example, which is near Gatwick Airport, which now has huge unemployment. And I suspect the schools in Crawley have not been well known for being problematic, but they also may not necessarily have been the ones that are standout either. So who is going to be there? What will the capacity be when those schools need to turn around? In a large multi-academy trust that's well organised, that, it will be there. In multi-academy trusts which are not well organised, it won't be there, but at least someone could be keeping an eye on them and rebroker them to somebody else. But if you're in a standalone academy trust, then I think that's where there's a real problem.
Okay, that's not something I'd thought about before, but really interesting. So we've got you mentioned there, Laura, the famous spaghetti diagram, and I've just taken a screenshot from David's. But can we put the diagram up again so that viewers can see what that looks like if they haven't had the pleasure of seeing it before? No, it doesn't look like we can. Oh well, maybe it will pop back in a moment. When it does, here it is. David, for anyone who might be experiencing some uncertainty or confusion here, I know you've got vast experience of talking through this diagram. Can you just really briefly tell us what's going on?
So the very first version of this was a handwritten version.
Yeah.
And I remember I was about to go into a meeting with I think it was with Justine Greeny actually, just shortly after she'd arrived, and there's a quaint old custom in the civil service. I don't know about the whole civil service, but in the DfE, that when a new minister arrives, they have about a month of what's called teach-ins, where various people with particular responsibilities go and basically put on the table to the Secretary of State what it is that they're working on. And I had spent quite a lot of time with Nicky Morgan really positioning my role as NSC around school improvement. And not just about being a hoover up of schools to become academies, although that was clearly an element of the role. But I wanted to really root it in school improvement. And I had 20 minutes with her. That's all I had, 20 minutes. And everybody else had produced these incredibly dense documents, which I really wasn't sure whether she'd read. And I thought, I'm only going to get 20 minutes with her. She's going to know I've just come out of the school sector. I'm not really a dyed-in-the-wool civil servant. I need to do something differently. And so on a great big piece of paper, with a couple of the other colleagues in the other RSC teams, we drew exactly what you see there in felt pens and squiggly lines and everything. And the point I wanted to make to her, there were two really. One is school improvement is not one-dimensional. It's not even two-dimensional. And if you think this is simply special measures to good, then we're going to leave a whole load of schools out of this conversation. And if we're thinking about what the role of RSCs is going to be, and we're going to think about how we're going to invest in school improvement, we have to recognize there are different trajectories that need a different approach. That was number one. And then the second one was that whenever she goes to visit schools or she visits trusts, or they come in and meet with her, or she sits on a round table, or whatever she does, have this at the back of your mind and ask trust leaders if they can tell you what stage of the journey their schools are on. Because if you've given some really challenging schools that have failed badly to a multi-academy trust, you cannot afford for them to fail again. They've got to get this right. They've got to make it better. And understanding what your schools need is the key to being successful. And so she really liked that. She folded it up. She put it in her wallet.
Right.
And then later on, when I wanted to start using the slide in presentations, once she'd said she approved of that,
Right.
we turned it into the diagram, but there was a PowerPoint slide. But its original conception was literally an A4 piece of paper with a few felt pens scribbled on it, and she really liked that model.
Brilliant. I mean, I think for me, the what that model captures, which I think is schools like who are in the D trajectory, the slow decliners, which are so easy to miss. And probably very easy for the schools themselves not to know that they're in slow decline, because things feel okay. They don't feel like they've changed very much. And I've certainly visited schools that I would definitely put in that category, and it's very hard for them to understand that they're there themselves. I mean, I imagine that's led to some awkward conversations over the years.
Well, there's a truth about that, which is that schools who have really appalling results aren't necessarily delivering the worst strategy. It's just that the results haven't caught up with the plan. Yeah. And you have to be able to tell the difference between a school where it is going to get better, but you've got to be patient, versus a school where they're just throwing the kitchen sink at it and there's no sense of prioritization. But the reverse on the other schools is true. But because the school is sitting on an outdated Ofsted inspection, and because results are still looking proportionately okay, doesn't mean that they're not failing and that they're beginning to decline. And the point I wanted to make, particularly about schools going into trust and who is the right trust for this school, was that you have to understand that an Ofsted inspection is a snapshot. It's a moment in time. And even a school that's inspected on any given day and gets a good judgment, you can't guarantee it's going to be good on Monday, because things change. And so you have to recognize that there is a fluidity to the way that schools are improving. In my view, they're improving or they're declining. They're not really staying static for very long. And for ministers who've got a window of maybe 3 or 4 years, or in recent times even less than that, have got to be convinced that their strategies and their policies are working. And they have to balance that desire for quick results and quick outcomes with the reality that measuring progress is a really important part of the improvement journey.
Okay, so I'm gonna skip us forward a little bit. We're going to come back to some other things later, but I want to ask you just briefly about the very end of the book, which is a chapter on managing risk. And that risk is inherent in probably any human activity, but particularly with schools, that every decision you make has the potential for going wrong or creating perverse incentives or having some kind of negative effect that you didn't foresee. Now, currently, and obviously this wasn't the case when you were writing the book, currently schools are having to deal with risks like never before with the COVID pandemic. And do you think that, well, first of all, the advice that you give in the chapter on risk, do you think it equally applies to the current state, or would there be things that you'd now be adding?
So actually, we wrote the chapter in April. It was the very last bit of the book that we put together, and we changed what we were originally planning because we were in the lockdown, and it was really apparent to me that I was hearing stories from conversations I was having with trusts around the country at that time that actually being in a trust was not a bad place to be when all of this challenge was being created, and that many trusts were helping maintain schools down the road or standalone academies to pick up on the last point. And so we did talk about that. And the second half of the chapter, as I recall it, was very much about what might the future look like coming out of this. And I think I made reference to McKinsey's work around the 5 phases of getting to the next normal. And so a lot of it was actually written. I think I even put a date in the book, actually, because I remember ironically thinking, someone's going to read this book in 3 years' time when all of this is over and wonder what he's talking about. So we actually did do that in April. And the point, however, that you make is a fair one, that what we knew in April is very different to what we know now, and the situation is very different. So I think the message around risk being something that you have to have a healthy appetite for, but it shouldn't be, I forget how we call it, it shouldn't be the devil on your shoulder that stifles decision making, nor should the lack of risk awareness mean that you can do whatever you like, is still, I think, very current around that.
So, so with the sort of decisions that schools are having to make at the moment about how to try to make classrooms and social spaces socially distant, how to operate bubbles and routes around schools, should teachers stay in their classrooms, should teachers be much more peripatetic, and there are risks and potential, costs and benefits to all of those decisions. If you were to sort of, in some way, sum up from a system leader perspective the advice that you think should be taken in here, what might you say?
So that's a tough question, but I would say something along the lines of no, it's fine. I would say something along the lines of this. I think school leaders in the main always feel that they're in control of their own destiny. Change happens quite slowly in the educational world, and of course you can have the phone call from Ofsted in the afternoon changes the direction of travel for a few weeks maybe, or even longer if it doesn't go how you hope. But fundamentally, change that we're seeing at the moment is unprecedented in certainly my experience around that. And so I think one of the bits of advice would be that you have to accept that this change is beyond your control, and if you try to control the change, you're going to be defeated by it. Right. So I think there's a really strong sense of actually having a reality that there are only so many things that you can control, and I think that then translates into the kind of conversations you have with people about not promising that you can solve all these different problems, because it's just inconceivable that you can do that. I think the second bit of advice would be that we talked earlier on in this conversation about education being a people industry. It's never been more important that we recognize that, and that we are there for our communities, for our children and for the staff, and that we think really strategically about what people need and how we help them, and how we are as mindful about their health and well-being and their mental preparedness to teach as it is about the art and the science of teaching in itself. Then I think the third element of it is, and I think I've come to this realization since the start of this academic year, that educational outcomes and educational progress still matters. And if we get too sucked up in this whole notion of just COVID and managing the pandemic, we will lose sight of what the fundamental purpose of schools is, which is to give kids a great education. And whilst I don't mean that we should now put in place rigorous performance management systems. If it was down to me, I wouldn't have Ofsted near a school till next September, but it's not, and therefore that probably won't happen. But actually, to be thinking about the quality of educational experience that children are getting now matters every bit as much now as it did a year ago, I think. And those trusts and those schools who agree with that are still, I think, improving their schools whilst at the same time trying to manage the challenge of the pandemic.
Right. Okay, that's an important message. So one of the potential risks is in trying to manage the current situation is that a trust or a school might conceivably lose focus on what you're talking about there, the children's academic success. Laura, during the show tonight, we've also been talking to Stuart Locke about exams. Should they go ahead? Should they not? What's your view on that?
On the exam stuff, I mean, in an ideal world, I'll go ahead. If it was up to me, I'd probably put some conditions out for when you'll make that decision and make them later. I don't see any disbenefit actually in making the decision on exams nearer to the time. And I know that sounds really awful, but I think that if we believe that each year what we're doing when we're getting students to learn stuff and at the end they do an exam is a reasonably good way of ensuring that people learn things, then ultimately we have to back that even without the exams. And I remember I did a phone in very early after the school closures on BBC Radio 5. And a guy phoned in and he was devastated. His daughter had been up all night crying her heart out because she really wanted to sit her English exams and she wanted to be a journalist, and she was now devastated and felt that her dreams had been taken from her. And, you know, you're sat there on the end of a phone call aware that maybe up to 1 million people are listening and you're trying to work out how to be wise. And the only thing I could think to say to him, which is true, is that the exam is kind of the least important bit. It was the fact that she'd learnt this stuff that really mattered. She now knows how to do all of those things, whether she sits an exam or not, whether she gets the grade or not. She does actually know how to read an article. She does actually know how to write beautifully. She's worked out how to craft things. She can have conversations about descriptions, and she understands the richness of life from the work that she's done. And that sounds really rubbish when a kid is crying about their exam grade, but it is nevertheless true. So even if we had to cancel exams next April again, that would be awful. But I just sort of feel like it wouldn't be a problem to make the decision at that moment in time. What we do have to have is a backup, of course. And in the process, everyone's coming up with that now. I don't think there's any easy solutions. And I almost think it doesn't really matter that much which one you pick. You pick one, you try and enforce it. And as happened this year, if it goes wrong, you come up with something else. We've had massive grade inflation, and I would have thought it was going to be a massive problem. It might actually not be. It might be fine. Extra kids will go to university. Some extra kids might drop out of A-levels. Maybe it's okay. But it doesn't mean it would be okay to do that every year. It's just that when you're in a crisis, if you have to back up and change things for a little bit, you probably can. So that's where I'm at on exams at the moment.
No, that's a good point. And it reminds me of, I can't remember exactly where it is in the book, where I think, David, you say something along the lines of Ofsted inspections and exam results are just the outward rubber stamping of actually, is there a good quality of education happening, or are there really important things going on? And the exam results and the rest of it are important, but they're not the thing itself.
Yeah, I mean, whilst I've got some issues, and I've spoken about my thoughts about the accountability sector, I want to be really clear that there has to be a public recognition of how we regulate the education system that the taxpayer pays for. So I'm not anti-accountability in any sense of that way around, but I am really clear that, you know, the set of exam results that children receive, or the school receives in August, for example, or July in the case of SATs, are the product of work that has already taken place. School improvement is in the now and it's in the future. And Ofsted inspections are always a look over your shoulder as what's already happened. You know, the data that is used to inform an inspection is data that you can no longer influence. And I think one of the challenges of an accountability system is I don't think it looks readily enough at the schools that are doing some great things right now, that by the time those children who are currently in year 9 get to year 11, the school will be unrecognizable.
Yeah.
But they're also trying to fix the fact that maybe those year 11 kids have had 4 years of pretty weak teaching. And unless you recognize that moment in time snapshot of a set of exam results and an Ofsted inspection is exactly that and no more than that, people will only ever chase the holy grail of a good or an outstanding inspection. And that worries me, that Ofsted has become a verb in our vocabulary, and that actually it drives so much of the motivation. School improvement is not about getting a good Ofsted grade. School improvement is about giving children a passport to what they go on to do next. No,
absolutely. And, you know, I think that definitely comes very clearly in the book, whilst you're not explicitly critical Ofsted. The
Comes quite close occasionally.
well, you pull your punches, I think, David. And I think the Laura was alluding earlier to the Schools Week cover with you and Michael Wilshaw, and reading between the lines, one got the cover that there wasn't strong affection, should we say?
With Michael? Do you mean with Michael Wilshaw?
Yeah.
No, Michael and I got on very well.
Oh, okay.
What I liked about Michael was that he was the sort of guy that we could disagree in private and disagree in public with, but then we could talk about it. And I really appreciated that, and that was something which hasn't always been the case, I think, with Ofsted. So there was one memorable moment, and there's a photograph in the book, I think, where Neil Carmichael, when he was Education Select Committee chair, invited Michael and I together at the same time to a select committee, and we had a pre-call, he and I, about that, right. and it was almost like what I would imagine happens the night before a boxing bout is about to happen, where the referee says what the rules are going to be, and no punching below the belt. And all
okay.
And we agreed almost the point at which areas where there were no limits and which areas there were. And I really appreciated working that way. We had a very different job to do. He definitely thought RSEs, we were parking our tanks on his lawn. No question about that. His successor felt that even more profoundly, I think.
Right.
But we as former heads of schools, we had a lot in common.
Right. Okay. No, that's really interesting. There's perhaps scope to read between the lines there as well. You do make the point in the book as well about sort of the fact that going back to the idea of results is that sometimes you've had conversations with officials at the DfE where results haven't improved as quickly as people might want, and they've challenged you, said, are you sure you've done the right job and put them in the right trust? And on reflection, you've gone back and said, no, I am convinced that they're in the right trust. We'll have to wait for the results. Quick fixes are not the answer. Yes,
and that's another example where the spaghetti diagram really helped me, because the answer to the question is the spaghetti diagram in some respects. And obviously, many of those decisions that I was defending with the minister had been done by one of my RSE colleagues. So I needed to be really clear and understand the process that regional schools commissioner had undergone to make that decision. But the three questions that I would always ask of an RSE if we were in that position where we were having to defend a decision that had been taken was, number one is, how good is the governance, how good is the leadership, and how credible is the school improvement plan? And then if I was satisfied on those three fronts, I could defend it and say, look, I think you've got to be patient. The results have dipped this year. They've gone backwards. That's not what you expected. But this is a school which has been failing for maybe 7 or 8 years. And you're not going to turn around that kind of failure in one academic calendar. So, and different ministers were more amenable to that. Right. Nick Gibb was very good about that. He understood that. He'd always want to know what the plan was, but he was good around it. John Nash certainly bought into that idea. I had to work slightly harder with Theodore on 1 or 2 of those conversations.
Right. Okay. No, there's a whole sort of private conversation to have where we ask you to elaborate on those sorts of things. I understand you're not going to go further in public. I'd love to ask you, because one of the case studies, I should say to people who haven't read the book, there are lots of case studies throughout this where typically it'll be a CEO of a different trust that you interview or provides something. I'd love to come back in a moment and ask you how those were chosen and compiled. But the one that particularly interested me, because it's very close to my heart, was a school that I worked in years ago called Wyvern Community School in Weston-super-Mare, which became part of your old trust, the Cabot Learning Federation, in, you'll remember the date. Was it 2011?
Yes, it was. Yeah, well done. Yeah,
2011. And now, and I've visited it fairly recently. Obviously, there's a new build there, so it's visually unrecognisable. But it just feels like my Ofsted inspections aside. You know what? I've been into schools that have outstanding inspection results, and you go in and it feels paper thin. And I went into Hans Price, and it felt like a school I had confidence in immediately. It felt unrecognisable to the place that I'd worked in, mainly because I'd gone and was no longer dragging down results, I'm sure. But can you tell us a little bit about that journey?
Yeah, I can. And to just to answer your earlier question, we thought quite a lot about the case studies, and every case study that we've included in the book is of a trust that I know well and have visited it. I didn't want to include a trust in there just upon somebody else's recommendation. I wanted to know that, as far as I could possibly tell, it was a good trust, and that it was going to be an authentic case study. And Laura and I we gave the chief executives a brief, but the words are theirs.
Yeah.
We didn't edit or change very much. Whatever they wrote is pretty much what we published. And I did want to include a Cabot Learning Federation case study in it for obvious reasons. And there were a couple I could have chosen. The transformation of Bristol Brunel Academy, Bristol Metropolitan Academy in Bristol were two other possibilities. But Hans Price really interested me because of the challenge that Weston-super-Mare as a community presents. And whilst people will think of quite readily, I'm sure, of towns and cities around the country that they will automatically think are more deprived, I don't think there are many more challenged than Weston-super-Mare. I think it's a seaside town that's been in decline, and it's a tough place to live and a tough place to find work. And I think Wyvern the predecessor school was a very good example of that. I thought it did some remarkable work around supporting children in that community, but standards and results were weak and poor. And I had a contract from the North Somerset Council to be an NLE working with the school from 2009 to 2011, and got to know the school really well in that time. And had to put up quite an argument with the board at Cabot to take a school in Weston-super-Mare when everything else was located in Bristol. And it was a risk, I think, to do that. But I felt we got to know the school and felt an attachment to the community, wanted to continue with the work. But Hans Price Academy is a really good example of a school that took probably 4 or 5 years to move and get it to where it is today. And it is unrecognizable. And the credit for that goes to Tony Searle, the principal, and his leadership team, and to Steve Taylor, who was my successor, for the way that they've developed and improved that school. But we had an inspection in the school in late 2011. I think it was about May 2011, maybe 2012. I can't remember the exact date. Very soon after we'd taken the school into trust, and the school got a good judgment, and it was absolutely a wobbly good. It was not a secure good. But you can't underestimate what confidence that gave to the school and to the community, that it was for the first time it had been judged to be good. And that summer, the results, I think, were the first time the school had been above national average in any public indicator. And I think that was the platform then for the school to continue to thrive and to improve. And undoubtedly being part of a strong trust where there was capacity to provide support, challenge as well, of course, and to move talented people down the M5 from Bristol to Weston-super-Mare to do a very specific job is the reason why the school is performing as well as it is today. And I think that's a huge success of the Federation, a huge success of the Trust, but absolutely down to the quality of leadership and teaching in the school. And I'm very proud of that piece of work.
Yeah, and I think one of the things, from having a bit of personal knowledge about it, which I find, really fascinating piece of information is that obviously I think Tony Searle taking over was it 2014 that he became head?
Yeah, it was one of the last appointments I made before I left. Yeah.
Oh, really? Was it? Okay, so I think that that was probably maybe the real turning point. But what you all know, Nikki Monroe, who deputy head there. And when I started, she was doing her NQT year, and she had been a teaching assistant at the school, and her children had gone to the school, and she's lived in that community for years. And her journey from at Wyvern and now in Hans Price and part of the Cabot Learning Federation, from being a teaching assistant to being deputy head, is a really remarkable little story beneath the surface, and one which that gets easily missed. But all of these human things that
Tony is a good example, you see, because Tony actually, before he was appointed as principal at Hans Price, had been an assistant principal at 3 other CLF academies.
Right.
Because I'd met Tony on an SSAT leadership program that I was running, developing leaders, I think it was, and he was at World Secondary School in Weston-super-Mare at the time. But I'd seen the work that he'd done around school improvement at a department level, and I appointed him to work at Bristol Brunel. Then from Bristol Brunel, he went to Bristol Met, from Bristol Met to Cabot. So by the time he went to Hans Price, he'd spent at least a year or 18 months in 3 other trust schools. So he knew the trust inside out.
Right.
And we used to joke that he was the poster boy because he kept on moving around. You know, you could, all the open evenings, parents would go, "I've just seen you at that school." And so he and I probably were the ones that knew the trust at that time the best. But I think that's a lovely story about his career development being in sync with the trust's growth and trust's improvement development as well.
No, I mean that's a really interesting thing that you've got people moving around the trust, but also within a trust, there's room for people to grow within individual schools. That it's not either or, and that was the point I was clumsily trying to tease out.
No, it's a very good point. It's a very good point.
And I think, you know, people miss that. People think, you know, that, oh, you know, it's all about people being parachuted in and sort of controlled from outside, and it very much isn't. And you make the point in the book elsewhere that one of the, I think I really liked this idea that you talk about the teaching staff within a trust as the faculty for education, yeah. And that they are a trust-wide resource, and that there is real room for teachers to grow their careers within trusts in ways which are impossible really outside of trusts.
We used to do a thing at Cabot called Federation Network Night. In fact, I think they still do it. I saw a tweet about it this week. And it was an afternoon, usually the Thursday, I think, of the last week of every half term, where all of the subject teachers, primary and secondary, would come together at one venue. And that was where the idea came from, because I would go to science, maths and English, because they were the largest groups by far. And you'd have 70 to 80 science specialists in a room, and you sit and realize this is my science faculty. They just happen to teach in all these different schools. But actually, if I'm going to improve standards in science, these are the people that are going to do it. And it's a very physical and visible representation of this one organization model, because you can use the words and find all different ways to describe belonging to this trust. But until you look around the room and realize that everybody in the room is a science teacher or an English teacher, and we're all committed to the same thing, then it becomes really powerful.
Yeah. And so that was a really nice, something I've never come across before, the faculty of education within a trust. So there's a couple of other questions that I had for you that I'd just like to put to you before you tell me that you've got something else to do and need to move on. The one of the things that I thought was an interesting question to ask you is because you talked there about you talked about one of the really, really important things that a CEO has to do is to be aware of whether there's somebody within the organization that could be doing their job that can eventually replace them. And I thought it'd be really interesting to ask you about that from your perspective, moving from being CEO of the Cabot Learning Federation into being Regional Schools Commissioner. How did that work for you, identifying your successor?
Well, it was a good process, I think. I mean, my recollection was that I got appointed to the RSC job quite late in the year. I think it was late April. It had been a long process of the recruitment process, so it was late April. So one of the first challenges was I had a 6-month notice period in my contract, and of course, the board agreed for me to go in the September start, but there wasn't a lot of time to make that appointment. So there was in the first instance there was an interim solution in the first few months, and then the job was advertised nationally, and there was a strong national field applied, and my recollection was 4 or 5 people were interviewed. But to be perfectly honest, Steve Taylor was always going to be a difficult candidate to beat. Steve had been the principal of Bristol Metropolitan Academy, and I describe in the book how I met Steve. I went to visit him in his school before his interview, and I saw him teach this amazing lesson. We got on really well. I thought he was a fabulous teacher, and he was appointed to Bristol Met and did a great job there. So it was always going to be, I think, quite a tough ask for an external candidate who hadn't been in the trust to be competitive in that arena. And Steve, I wasn't involved in the process. I'd left by then, but Steve was the standout candidate and was appointed as CEO. And I think the bit that was very unique, and probably unique, and will always be unique, is that I went from being the CEO to the Regional Schools Commissioner, and Steve became a CEO in my region. And so clearly I could no longer have that relationship with Cabot. And that was quite strange for me and Steve, I think. Dominic Harrington, who at that time was the South East South London RSC, took oversight of the CLF. And I would hear decisions about schools that were coming into Cabot from him. And so Steve and I walked that line very, very respectfully. We didn't talk. We didn't meet up in that period of time. And I would have loved to have been able to support him in that period of time, but it was just unrealistic to think I could do that. So I was kind of quite arm's length in terms of that succession relationship. But what it made me think about, and we talked about that in the book, is that there is a risk with always going for the internal candidate because you miss the opportunity of fresh thinking. But if you've built a particular culture in the trust that's working and it is the underbelly of everything that you do, you want someone that understands that to be able to take it to the next level, and that's often going to be the internal candidate.
Yeah, no, I mean that's a really interesting point to make. So one of the other sort of things that it became clear, you know, I did know it, but it became clear sort of reading the book, is that you've had all of these roles, but one role that you've not had, David, is being a head teacher with a CEO above you, and so as thinking back to your time as a head, had you been in a trust with a CEO, what would you have wanted as a head working within a trust?
Oh, complete autonomy.
Well, to be fair, we do actually talk about this because you did sort of have this problem, and it's one of the reasons why you actually do like academy trusts, which was that, of course, David was one of the earliest federation heads, and that actually came with then having a number of different boards that you had to report to, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So you at least had not CEOs.
Yeah, so you talk about how difficult it was to make decisions within that environment.
Yeah, it was. That was a tricky period, I think. I mean, that was a slightly facetious argument, answer rather to that. But
no,
but I think there is an element of no matter what role you have, you always have a boss. That's the reality. So Laura's dead right. You know, that period from 2007 to 2009, my title was executive head over John Cabot Academy and Bristol Brunel Academy. Both were in effect standalone academies with their own boards, but a steering group was created to oversee the interface between the two schools, and they didn't really hold me to account, but they wanted to be involved in literally every decision, and I just felt that just clogged up the process a little bit and slowed us down in some ways. But they were doing it for all the right reasons and had the right intentions around it. So, and then of course. My role as the CEO of the MAT, the Multi Academy Trust, meant that I had two chairs of board, both of whom took their job very seriously and absolutely held me to account. So whilst I wasn't reporting directly into a CEO, particularly Ron Ritchie, who was a professor at the University of West of England, who was the chair with whom I worked the longest. That was very definitely a line management relationship. And whilst there was a lovely balance and a blend of challenge and support, I knew I was accountable to him. So I did have that experience, although in a slightly different way to the way you posed the question.
Right. Okay. No, that's fair enough. But I think your answer is it's an important one, even though, as you say, perhaps slightly facetious. That to an extent, people that become appointed as head teachers probably want to be head teachers because firstly they think they can do the job and that they will want autonomy, and so it is a difficult conundrum to solve, that, isn't it? That you're working with a group of people who inherently feel that they deserve and need some autonomy.
Yeah, they do, but I mean, Laura gave a brilliant answer to your question about that earlier, and that relationship between autonomy, accountability, and responsibility. It doesn't. It's not a blank check. It doesn't come with a complete remit to do whatever you like. And I think there is something about the role of a head teacher in a trust being quite different to the role of a head teacher in a standalone school. But even those people who are working in the maintained sector or in a standalone academy, I think, have a responsibility to the wider system and to the wider sector and the community that they serve, even including children who don't come to their school. So I still think there is a level of responsibility that you have to play a wider role, even if you're in a slightly different setting.
Right. Okay. And so one of the other things that came out, which I thought was fascinating, is you talk about the differences between being a CEO and being a head teacher, and finding out the hard way that going as a CEO into a school and observing lessons or telling children off was something you could no longer do.
Yes.
Can you tell us a little bit about why that's a problem for CEOs?
Well, because fundamentally you confuse people big time. So and I did that. I made that mistake really badly in the early days of Bristol Brunel Academy, where I did go and watch lessons for all the right reasons, because we needed to have an impact quite quickly.
Yeah.
But of course, I suddenly realised I wasn't the only person watching lessons. The principal of the school and his leadership team were watching lessons. And if I saw a piece of behaviour that I intervened with on the corridor, the children were not slow in asking me who I was. Not quite as politely as that, because actually I wasn't the principal. I wasn't the person that was on the gate every morning. I wasn't the person taking their assemblies. So I realised that I had to find another way to do that. And the way that I got around it was I did watch lessons, but I always watched it with a member of the leadership team to kind of triangulate what they were seeing. The only time I intervened after that with behaviour is if there was a danger that the child was going to get hurt, if something was going to escalate. And I just did that as a human being, not as a CEO. But you learn very quickly that actually that day-to-day visibility is very different when you're in the CEO or even the executive head role. Because actually, back in the story of 2007, I was an executive head, not the CEO then. So, and I think that's probably one of the issues about the transition from those roles into the CEO role that people find quite difficult. And I did find that those 2 years were a real test. And it was only after we got to a position where the trust formed itself as a legal entity that I had some authority to make some decisions, that the job began to make sense to me.
There's something quite nice about it, though, in the book where we talk about that journey as a teacher, which is that you actually give up and change your role several times. So there's even just that bit when you go from being a classroom teacher, if you decide to go up to being a head of department or a head of year or an assistant head, the way that the students will treat you when you walk into a classroom may be quite different than they will with another class teacher, and you have to manage that quite carefully. I know that when I was a new teacher, it might be great in the moment if the head teacher comes in and all the kids are suddenly quiet, but if when they walk out again they start, it's not very helpful. So actually, as a senior leader within a school, you also have to manage, well, what is my role here, and actually who's in charge in a room, and make sure that teacher doesn't feel disempowered by you wandering in and out. That then becomes the same as you move up to being a head teacher, the same as becoming a CEO, I think. And one of the things, David, I think you talk about in here, and certainly several CEOs said over the years when I profiled them with Schools Week, I used to ask this question, which was, if you were invisible for a day, what would you do? And loads of them used to say that they would like to be able to go into their schools not as the CEO, because one of the problems is as well, all the staff do know who you are. So the kids may not, but the staff do, and they don't always act quite how you want them to. You want them to be as they would normally be, but then they're not. So how do you manage that as a CEO? Because you can no longer really see what schools look like without you in them. So it's a lesson that you have to learn over and over again all throughout your career.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, Laura. I mean, I've certainly found visiting schools in a sort of consultancy role and sort of being asked to provide some sort of evaluation for the head teacher, that I've seen things sometimes that they're not able to see because they carry that mantle of authority with them wherever they go, and it almost warps reality, because they're the head teacher or the CEO or whatever it is, and so everybody treats them differently. And to an extent, there's a difficulty with. They're showing you the things that they hope you want to see, and when when they've no idea who you are, then perhaps people are more allowed to be themselves. And I imagine that's a very difficult thing. I mean, you talk a lot about trust in the book, David, about how you generate that, and you go into some detail about the sorts of things that you should be doing about being trustworthy and that sort of stuff. But how does a CEO, how does a head teacher get around that sort of distorting effect of their own presence?
I think the answer lies in being authentic. I think that's the answer. I think you have to be true to yourself, and you have to be consistent in your behaviours. I think that's the way you do it. I mean, I was listening to Laura's answer and nodding about that impact that you have upon other people, and you have to be mindful and intuitive enough to realise that you have an impact. The only exception that I could think of it was that in the final year that I was at CLF, I spent most Friday afternoons going to visit a reception class in one of the primary schools and doing the end of day story. And I'd sit on the mat and I'd read the story to the kids, and I kind of did it. I did it quite selfishly initially because I wanted to end my week doing that. I wanted to just feel that no matter what had happened to me in the week, I wanted to do something that was a really nice thing to do. It also gave me a chance to spend Friday afternoon in the primary schools, which is important. I'm not a primary specialist, so but I still wanted to be in the schools. And I think that was probably the one time where I felt I was myself. I was completely natural. It wasn't loaded around the fact that I was a bloke in a suit. I'd take my tie off, I'd take the jacket off, I'd sit on the carpet, and we'd read a story together. And I think if you can get the joy of leadership still in your life through that kind of pursuit, and not just get too carried away with the role and the status of the role, and keep yourself grounded, I think that's one of the ways to answer your question.
Okay, no, that's a good answer. So Laura, question for you, just to sort of as we come to the end of the interview, having done this, having spent all this time in David's head, so to speak, and helping shape the book, have you been tempted to go to be back in schools, to sort of have some sort of leadership role in a school?
Yeah, definitely. And I think that I never came out of schools either because
Right.
I didn't like teaching or anything like that.
No.
I thought I would stay in teaching forever, and then found myself in a weird situation of being taken to court by Michael Gove over this freedom of information request, and became a journalist and did Teach Tap. So it's all been a sort of weird sojourn for me. What I think has definitely happened throughout the pandemic is it's a good reminder actually of the fact that it is a public service. And that ultimately the thing I always loved about schools is that it shouldn't really matter what else is going on in the world. This is the one place where every child in the community can come. And when you get to the gate, you're in a new world, you're in our world, and we build it together for you. And it doesn't matter what happened at home today, and it doesn't matter if something bad. And unfortunately, when the pandemic came, of course, that social contract got slightly broken, and now we're all trying to rebuild it. But it's always been the thing that's so compelling. And what I was really skeptical about before writing this book was the idea of collaboration. I was always someone who wasn't that convinced that it was possible, that it was a good idea, that actually it all seemed like all these long words, accountability and everything else, they all seemed like something that people sit around in rooms and talk about. And I never really saw the point. But through the book, through the pandemic in particular, you start to see that no one can do this alone. Our energies ebb and move at different times. If one school has suddenly had a coronavirus outbreak and loads of its staff are out, where do they get the help from? Well, if they don't have anybody coordinating that help, they're just going to have to close. But if you work in a group where you've already got these relationships and they're hard to build, but you can do it, then actually you could share some of your staff. You could share some of your expertise. If you've got an IT specialist over here, then it's easier to make sure that everybody's online. And what I think it's just really brought home the importance of schools, the fact that collaboration is real and can be done. And to go back to that point from earlier, if we don't have schools working together in this way, then what a massive waste. What a waste of resources where everybody could be sharing, not in an idealistic way, just in a very straightforward way, in the examples given in the book, that will help any child, whatever school that they're going into, and regardless of whatever is going on in the community, to have a really, really great education. So yeah, it's definitely inspired me. Maybe one day I'll be back.
Yeah. Well, we'll watch this space. You heard it here first. So David Carter, Laura McInerney, thank you so much for allowing me to waste some of your valuable time this afternoon. It's been an absolute treat talking to you. The book, Leading Academy Trusts, why some fail, but most don't. So sorry, got it right there. It's a great read. When I started through it, I was thinking, oh, this is maybe going to be a bit dry and maybe maybe a bit niche. But I genuinely think that everybody who works in education should read this book. It's not just for CEOs, because that would be a very small market. I genuinely learnt a lot from it and feel richer as a result. So published by John Catt, available on the internet, and I commend it to you. But thanks ever so much for your time, and I hope we can talk again in the future. Thank you.
Thanks, Dave.
Every high